On the afternoon of June 8, 1967, at 2 p.m., without any warning, Israeli aircraft initiated an assault. Israeli jet fighters made their first strafing runs, coming in from multiple directions and firing rockets and cannon fire at the ship's hull, structure, and most critically, its antenna and communications equipment. This was interpreted by survivors as a deliberate effort to silence the ship before it could call for help. The Liberty's four 50 caliber machine gun mounts, its only defensive armament, were destroyed in the opening minutes, killing or wounding the sailors manning them. The ship's topside was hit repeatedly. Sailors who rushed topside to help the wounded were cut down. Life rafts deployed in the water were destroyed, an act that survivors found chilling as it seemed designed to prevent escape or rescue. More Israeli aircraft then joined the attack, dropping napalm on the ship's bow and deck, setting fires and causing horrific burns among crew members. To try and stop this attack, Liberty's communication teams desperately tried to send a distress call, but Israeli jamming targeted all U.S. emergency frequencies simultaneously, an extraordinary sophisticated act that showed detailed foreknowledge of American military communications. Eventually, one radio man managed to broadcast on a frequency that broke through. The air assault had lasted roughly 20 to 25 minutes and left the Liberty burning. 3 Israeli motor torpedo boats moved in at high speeds. They fired 5 torpedoes at the damaged vessel. One torpedo struck the Liberty on its starboard side, tearing a 40-foot wide hole in the hull and flooding the decks below. The torpedo hit the area where a large number of men were working below deck. 25 of the 34 men killed that day died in that single torpedo strike. Trapped in the flooding compartment, the torpedo boats encircled the ship, firing at the hull with cannons and machine guns at close range. Israeli sailors were repeatedly seen firing on American sailors in the water and on deck. Commander McGonigal, who was the captain of Liberty, was severely wounded in the leg, but he refused to leave the bridge and continued to command the ship throughout the attack. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions, though in an unusual ceremony. It was presented not at the White House, but quietly at the Washington Naval Yard, with no press coverage. Below decks, crew members fought flooding, fires, and chaos. Damage control parties worked desperately to keep the ship from sinking. The Liberty was taking on water rapidly, and there were fears the ship would go under. In the communications room, officers worked through smoke and blood to restore radio contact. When a distress signal finally got out, the Sixth Fleet, stationed nearby in the Mediterranean, launched aircraft to respond. However, those aircraft were recalled twice before reaching the Liberty, reportedly on orders from above. The attack lasted approximately 75 minutes in total. It stopped only after the Liberty managed to broadcast its distress call, and Israeli authorities apparently recognized the gravity of what was happening. Israeli torpedo boats approached the damaged ship, and an Israeli officer offered assistance via radio, which McGonigal refused. 34 American servicemen were killed, 171 were wounded. The ship itself suffered catastrophic damage across virtually every system: communications, propulsions, weapons, and hull integrity. The Liberty somehow remained afloat, a testament to the damage control of her crew. But let's go back to the beginning. Liberty was dispatched to the eastern Mediterranean because of the rising tensions in the Middle East in the spring of '67. War between Israel and its Arab neighbors like Egypt, Jordan, and Syria was looking increasingly inevitable. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Agency wanted eyes and ears in the region to monitor the situation. The Liberty was ordered to position herself off the Sinai coast and collect signal intelligence from all parties, not just the Arabs but also the Israelis. The United States wanted an independent, unfiltered picture of what was happening on the ground during the war, separate from what either side was officially reporting. The Liberty's job was to listen to military communications, troop movements, battlefield reports, and command-level signals from all combatants. When the Six-Day War broke out on June 5, '67, the Liberty was already in the area. Her mission crystallized around several key intelligence objectives, the first one being tracking the collapse and retreat of Egyptian forces in the Sinai. They also wanted to monitor Israeli military operations, including signals from the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF, regarding their battlefield progress and intentions. By June 8th, the fourth day of the war, Israel was winning decisively, and there were already indications that Israeli forces were advancing toward the Syrian Golan Heights. There were also deeply sensitive questions beginning to emerge about what was happening near Al-Arish in the Sinai, where reports of atrocities against Egyptian prisoners of war. The Liberty was sitting just off the coast and listening to everything. She was in a position to capture signal intelligence about all of it, which would make the Israelis look bad. Liberty's location was 13 to 15 nautical miles off the Sinai coast in international waters. It put her squarely in the middle of an active war zone, yet she had virtually no defense capability. Her armament consisted of only 4 50 caliber machine guns, weapons more suited to repelling small boats and defending against a military attack. She had no armor, no missiles, no fighter cover, and no escort vessel. She was more like a sitting duck if someone was going to attack her. Despite reports from Liberty's commanders for a destroyer escort, given how close she was to an active conflict. These requests were denied by Washington. She was sent into harm's way essentially unprotected, relying entirely on her status as a clearly marked American naval vessel in international waters to keep her safe. This detail will be important later. The people on board this ship were regular U.S. Navy sailors handling the ship's navigation, engineering, and seamanship. The NSA assigned signal intelligence specialists and cryptologists, many of whom were Arabic linguists, trained specifically for this kind of mission. They also had communications and electronic warfare technicians who operated the vast arrays of listening equipment packed into the ship's interior. Many of the crew had no idea of the full scope of the mission. The NSA personnel who worked in secure compartments below deck and regular sailors who were not cleared to enter. There was a distinct division aboard the ship between those who knew exactly what they were collecting and those who simply kept the vessel running. The Liberty was sent to gather intelligence on everyone, including Israel. This created an extraordinary, delicate diplomatic and intelligence situation. If the Liberty was intercepting Israeli military communications during a war that the U.S. was publicly staying out of, that was a deeply uncomfortable fact for both governments. When Israel launched its preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria on the morning of the 5th, the Liberty was already operating in the eastern Mediterranean. The war that U.S. intelligence agency had been anticipating for weeks had finally begun, and suddenly the Liberty's mission became crucially urgent. Washington needed independent, real-time intelligence. Neither Israeli nor Arab accounts of the fighting could be fully trusted. Both sides were shaping their own public narratives. No fewer than 6 separate messages were sent ordering the Liberty to pull back to a safer distance. The problem was that through a combination of miscommunications, bureaucratic confusion, and routing failures, these messages never reached Commander McGullen. They were sent through the wrong channels, misrouted through relay stations, or simply lost in the system. One critical message was routed through the Philippines before it eventually worked its way back, arriving hours after the attack had already happened. The Liberty was operating dangerously close to shore under orders that were already effectively obsolete. While Washington believed she had been ordered to move further out, nobody caught the disconnect. Nobody followed up to confirmed receipts. The ship sat where she was, and nobody in the chain of command realized she was still there. The crew was aware. They were close to an active war. They could sometimes pick up sounds and signals from the fighting. The intelligence specialists below deck were working long hours, collecting an enormous volume of signal traffic as Israeli forces swept through the Sinai. The ship had been overflown by aircraft during this period, and crew members had noted the Israeli markings. There was no particular alarm. The Israelis knew the Americans operated ships in the Mediterranean, and the relation between the two countries was friendly. Nobody aboard the Liberty seriously entertained the idea that they were in danger from Israeli forces. The perceived attack, if any, came from Egyptian or Soviet vessels, but on the Israeli side, there was internal military discussion about unidentified vessels off the coast. The Israeli Navy and Air Force had been tracking contacts in the area. On the morning of June 8 at approximately 6 a.m., an Israeli Nord reconnaissance aircraft, a large, slow-moving military transport used for patrol, flew over the Liberty at low altitude early in the morning. The aircraft was close enough that crew members could see the Israeli Air Force markings. The pilot would have had ample time to observe the ship's configuration, her hull number, her American flag, and her general profile. This is the first of the multiple documented overflights throughout the morning. Israeli military logs later confirmed these passes. Israeli forces had been observing the specific ship for the majority of the day. But regardless, the Liberty continued her intelligence collection mission below. The NSA analysts were perceiving a high volume of traffic. The war was going extremely well for Israel at this point. Egyptian forces in the Sinai had essentially collapsed, and Israeli attention was already turning towards Syria and the Golan Heights. Among the signals, Liberty was in a position to intercept during this period were communications relating to Israeli operations near El Arish, where it would later be alleged Israeli forces had executed Egyptian prisoners of war. Whether the Liberty actually intercepted such communications and what happened to that intelligence became one of the most sensitive and contested questions surrounding this entire incident. Around 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., additional Israeli reconnaissance aircraft made passes over the Liberty again. The aircraft came in low and slow on multiple occasions. These were deliberate observation runs, not casual sightings. Crew members on deck waved. There was still no sense of alarm aboard the ship. Meanwhile, in the Israeli military command structure, Liberty had been logged and discussed. There were communications within the Israeli system about the presence of this vessel. The official Israeli position after the attack would be that she was misidentified as an Egyptian ship, but the morning reconnaissance runs make this explanation extraordinarily difficult to believe. Around noon, the crew had lunch. The ship was sailing slowly, almost lazily, on a westward course, barely making way. The sea was calm. The American flag was flying invisible. There was a light breeze, enough to keep the flag extended and readable. McGonagall was on the bridge. The atmosphere aboard, despite being in a war zone, was relatively routine. The danger felt abstract. Nothing in the morning's overflights had suggested hostility. The Israeli military had received a report that El Arish was being shelled from the sea. This report was apparently false, or at the very least deeply confused. No vessel was shelling El Arish, but the report triggered a response within the Israeli military command and Air Force were alerted. The Liberty had been observed all morning. She was visually distinct. Her hull number was visible. She was flying an American flag. The El Qusir, the Egyptian ship Israel later claimed to have confused her with, was a fraction of the Liberty's size, had a completely different silhouette, and was not even in the area. At some point in the Israeli command chain, a decision was made that the vessel was not flying any flag, a claim contradicted by American crew members and by the physical evidence of the flag itself, which was recovered after the attack. One of Liberty's flag was actually shot down during the assault, at which crew members ran up an even larger holiday ensign, a ceremonial flag significantly bigger than the standard one, to make identification unmistakable. But another detail that needs attention is, as Israeli aircraft began their assault, they simultaneously jammed 5 of Liberty's 6 available radio frequencies, including the International Maritime Distress Frequency. This level of jamming was not something that could be improvised on the spot. It required advanced knowledge of which frequencies the Liberty used, information that pointed to either a detailed pre-attack or intelligence about U.S. Navy communications. The one frequency that got through succeeded largely because a resourceful officer, Chief Radio Man Wayne Smith, managed to rig a workaround after the primary communications equipment was destroyed. The NSA intelligence bases were located deep in the ship's interior. The analyst and linguist working there initially had no idea what was happening topside. The first indication for many was the ship's shuddering under cannon fire and the lights going out. There was no way for those below deck to evacuate quickly. The compartments were secured. In the chaos of the attack, with fires breaking out and the ship's communication systems being destroyed, the men below were essentially cut off from any situational awareness. They were working in the dark, literally and figuratively, not knowing if the ship was about to sink. Napalm was dropped on the ship's bow and deck, which burned at extremely high temperatures. What made the napalm especially significant to anyone investigating this case is that napalm is not a weapon you use against a ship you're trying to identify. It is a weapon designed to kill people and destroy equipment. Its use against the Liberty in survivors' testimony felt like a statement of intent. More evidence was showed this was not a warning or an accidental engagement. When the attack began, it became clear the ship was in serious danger. Crew members deployed several life rafts into the water. Israeli aircraft subsequently targeted those rafts, destroying them. The significance was not lost on the men. Under international law and laws of naval warfare, attacking life rafts is a war crime. The deliberate destruction of escape equipment suggested to survivors that the attackers intended to leave no survivors to tell the story. When Liberty's distress call finally got through, the 6th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral William Martin aboard the USS America, responded immediately. Aircraft were launched from carriers, USS America and USS Saratoga, to go to Liberty's defense, but those aircraft were recalled. The recall order came from high up in the chain of command, ultimately traceable to decisions made in Washington. The aircraft were turned back not once but twice. The reasoning given at the time involved concerns about escalation. Launching American warplanes in the middle of an Israeli air war could have unpredictable consequences. There was also reported concern about whether the attacking aircraft might be Soviet. But this idea doesn't work because it was already known or strongly suspected that the attackers were Israeli. The 6th Fleet commanders were furious. Admiral Martin reportedly expressed his anger forcefully. The men on those aircraft and the men aboard the Liberty were left without help during the most critical period of the attack. Topside, the scene was one of carnage. Dozens of men were wounded. Bodies were on deck. Fires were burning. The ship had lost most of her communications. Her speed was drastically reduced. The ship's doctor, Dr. Richard Kepfer, worked in conditions of extreme difficulty, operating and treating the wounded with limited supplies on a ship that was moving, listing, and still under intermittent fire from torpedo boats circling around. After firing their torpedoes, the Israeli motor torpedo boats did not withdraw. They continued to circle the Liberty, firing with deck cannons and machine guns. The crew members trying to help the wounded on deck came under fire. Men who attempted to use fire hoses on the burning section of the ship were also targeted. There was also a report of an Israeli helicopter that appeared over the ship during or shortly after the torpedo boat attack. The helicopter flew low over the Liberty. Crew members initially hoped it meant rescue was coming. It did not land. It simply observed and departed. A question arises from this report, such as why didn't the helicopter try to save some of the crew members? And what did the helicopters report back to its commanders? And how did this tie into the mistaken identity narrative? President Lyndon Johnson was informed of the attack, relatively quickly. Johnson's initial response was not to demand accountability, it was to manage the situation politically. Johnson was deeply committed to not allowing the Six-Day War to fracture U.S.-Israeli relations or to create an opening for Soviet intervention. The geopolitics stakes in Johnson's mind were enormous. He cared more about Israel than American soldiers. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was in contact with the Joint Chiefs throughout the attack. It was reported McNamara was involved in the orders to recall the Sixth Fleet aircraft, though the exact chain of command for that decision remains one of the most contested and least fully documented aspects of the entire incident. U.S. intelligence had information pointing towards deliberate intent on the Israeli side. There were intercepts of Israeli communications, there was a sophisticated jamming, there was the extended duration of the attack, there was the strafing of life rafts. Taken together, the intelligence picture was deeply inconsistent with a genuine accident. Despite all this evidence, the decision was made to accept Israel's explanation and to frame the entire incident publicly as a tragic mistake. The NSA had a significant part in Liberty's mission. Much of the crew worked for or alongside the NSA. The intelligence being collected was NSA product, and critically, the NSA had its own intercepts of communications surrounding the attack. NSA captured Israeli military communications during the attack period, communications that raised serious questions about whether the pilots and commanders involved knew they were attacking an American vessel. Some of these communications remained classified for decades. When they were partially declassified, they became one of the most important pieces of evidence examined by researchers, challenging the official narrative. The NSA's response was to classify everything as deeply as possible and as quickly as possible, protecting both its own resources, methods, and by extension, shielding the broader cover-up from public scrutiny. This sets the stage for the Naval Corps of Inquiry and the systematic suppression that followed. Before getting into what happened with Liberty's case, it is important to understand what a Naval Corps of Inquiry actually is. A Naval Corps of Inquiry is the United States Naval's most formal and powerful internal investigative body. It is the naval equivalent of a grand jury combined with a fact-finding tribunal. A court of inquiry is not just a casual administrative review. It is governed by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Its findings are supposed to represent the Navy's definitive, authoritarian account of what happened in a serious accident. When the Navy convenes one, it is signaling that the matter is grave enough to require the full weight of its investigative machinery. The decision to convene the court of inquiry was made with remarkable and suspicious speed. The attack occurred on June 8th, and the court of inquiry was convened on June 10th, 2 days later. On the surface, this might seem like urgency, but in reality, the speed was itself part of the problem. A proper investigation of this incident is complex, involving a classified intelligence gathering vessel, NSA personnel, a sophisticated military attack, questions of international law, signals intelligence, and potential war crimes. This would normally require weeks or months of preparation before testimonies could even begin. Evidence needed to be gathered and preserved. Witnesses needed to be identified and located. Classified materials needed to be properly assembled and reviewed. By rushing the process, the Navy, under political pressure from Washington, ensured that the investigation would be strategically incapable of doing its job properly. The timeline alone guaranteed an incomplete result. They were trying to sweep this incident under the rug. The Corps of Inquiry was headed by Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, who was appointed as its president. Kidd was a competent, experienced naval officer, but he was a man operating under extraordinary constraints that came directly from the highest levels of the Navy and from civilian leadership in Washington. Kidd was given explicit guidance about the scope and limits of his investigation before it even began. He was told, in effect, what the court was not to examine, which was the question of Israeli intent, which would be the central question that any honest investigation would have put at the top of its agenda, which was placed off limits. The court was directed to investigate the American side of the incident, what the Liberty was doing, how the crew responded, whether proper procedures were followed. It was explicitly not tasked with conducting a full investigation into the Israeli attack itself. This was an extraordinary and telling limitation. For example, imagine a court convened to investigate a murder that was told it could examine the victim's behavior but not the actions of the person who pulled the trigger. That is approximately the situation. Commander McGullen and other senior Liberty officers testified. A number of crew members gave statements about what they witnessed during the attack. Technical personnel spoke of the damage sustained by the ship. NSA personnel who had been working in the intelligence spaces below deck were largely not made available to the court in any meaningful way. Their testimonies about what they were collecting, what they may have intercepted, and what they experienced was effectively walled off behind NSA classification. Furthermore, no Israeli witnesses were called or requested. This alone is disqualifying any investigation that claims to have determined what happened. The attacking force was never questioned. Several crew members with direct eyewitness testimony were not given adequate opportunity to present their full accounts. Officers from the Sixth Fleet, who had launched and then been forced to recall rescue aircraft, were now called to give full testimony about those decisions and the orders behind them. A portion of the evidence determining what actually happened was classified at the highest levels before or during the court proceedings, one of them being the NSA communications related to the attack. Israeli military traffic during the assault period that potentially spoke directly to the question of whether the pilots and commanders knew they were attacking an American ship. These intercepts were classified above the level of the court of inquiry itself, meaning the admiral sitting on the court did not have clearance to examine the most important pieces of evidence surrounding the attack they were supposed to be investigating. A naval court of inquiry, the Navy's most powerful investigative body, was denied access to the most important evidence in the case it was investigating by a civilian intelligence agency operating under political direction from the White House and the Secretary of Defense. The records of the messages that had been sent ordering the Liberty to move further from shore were part of the record, but their full implications were not pursued. Understanding exactly how those messages were lost, who was responsible for the routing failures, and whether anyone had verified receipt would have opened up questions about command responsibility that nobody in Washington wanted answered publicly. The paper trail behind the decision to recall the aircraft launched to rescue the Liberty was not fully examined by the court. This was perhaps the most politically explosive piece of the puzzle, because a full examination of those orders would have led back directly to McNamara and potentially to the President Johnson himself. The proceedings lasted approximately 1 week. For an incident of this complexity involving a classified vessel, an international incident, and the deaths of 34 Americans, 1 week was inadequate. Witnesses who had more to say ran out of time. Lines of inquiry that would have required follow-up investigations were simply dropped. Documents that would have needed to be requested and reviewed through proper channels couldn't be obtained within the time frame. The 1 week deadline functioned as a structural guarantee that the investigation would remain shallow, but the court issued its findings. The court concluded that the attack was tragic, appeared to have resulted from a case of misidentification by Israeli forces, largely because it was not empowered to seriously examine Israeli intent and had no Israeli witnesses or military documentation before it. The findings were then classified, meaning the American public, the families of the dead, and the survivors themselves had no meaningful access to even those limited conclusions. But it doesn't end there. One of the most morally troubling aspects of the entire suppression was what happened to the crew after the court concluded. Crew members of the USS Liberty were given direct orders not to discuss the attack. These orders were explicit, unambiguous, and backed by threat of the court-martial under the UCMJ. Sailors were told that discussing this attack with the press, with their families, with members of Congress, and with anyone outside official channels could result in serious criminal prosecution. This was not a gentle suggestion or a bureaucratic request for discretion. It was a legally enforceable order of silence imposed on American servicemen who had just survived a devastating military attack and watched their shipmates die. The effect on the men was profound and lasting. In some cases, survivors were unable to speak about it, unable to seek any form of public acknowledgement, unable to advocate for their dead shipmates or for themselves. Many described the enforced silence as a second wound, perhaps in some ways more damaging than the physical injuries they had sustained. Some men lived with PTSD that went unacknowledged and untreated in an area when PTSD was not yet a recognized condition. They had experienced a catastrophic combat event and then been ordered to pretend it didn't happen. Families of the dead were given limited information. Many did not learn the full circumstances of how their loved ones died for years, while some never did. The Medal of Honor is the United States' highest military decoration. Its presentation is traditionally a major public ceremony held at the White House, presided over the President, attended by press and family, announced publicly, and celebrated as an example of American valor for the nation to honor. McDonnell's Medal of Honor was presented at the Washington Naval Yard by the Secretary of the Navy, not at the White House, not by the President, and not with any press coverage. The citation itself was carefully worded to describe McDonnell's actions in vague terms like his leadership, his courage, his seamanship, without clearly stating what had happened, who had attacked the ship, or under what circumstances he had displayed those qualities. This was done for a certain reason. A White House ceremony with press coverage would have required public discussion of the Liberty incident. Questions would have been asked, such as the circumstances of the attack and the administration's handling of it would have been subjected to public scrutiny. By burying the ceremony, the Johnson administration managed to honor McDonnell in a way that simultaneously acknowledged his extraordinary bravery and erased the context that made it meaningful. For McDonnell himself, and for the surviving crew, this felt like a final hit layered on top of everything else. The highest honor their country could have given them handed out in secret because the government was ashamed of the circumstances that it was earned under. Israel formally apologized for the attack and eventually paid compensation to the families of the dead and to the wounded, a process that took years and was conducted through back channels rather than any public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The compensation payments were structured in a way that Israel explicitly framed as humanitarian gestures rather than admissions of liability or guilt. By accepting compensation framed this way, the United States effectively helped Israel avoid any formal legal acknowledgement of responsibility. The State Department's handling of the entire matter was oriented entirely toward preserving the U.S.-Israeli relationship and maintaining the fiction of a close allied partnership. Diplomats who might have pressed harder for accountability were given clear signs from the top that this was not a battle Washington wanted to fight. In the normal course of events, the killing of 34 American servicemen and a military attack on a U.S. naval vessel would have triggered congressional investigation. The Armed Service Committee, the Intelligence Committees, and the Foreign Relations Committee all would have both the authority and the institutional motivation to hold hearings, demand documents, call witnesses, and get answers. But in this case, none of that happened in any serious way. A small number of members of Congress expressed private concern or pressed quietly for more information. None mounted a serious public challenge, though. The institutional machinery that was supposed to provide oversight of exactly this kind of situation essentially stood down. But in the 90s and 2000s, more information was released due to the Freedom of Information Act, which was the declassification review process. What those documents revealed, even in their heavily redacted form, was deeply significant. There were NSA intercepts of Israeli communications from the day of the attack. They were relevant to the question of intent. The content of those intercepts, what exactly was said in Israeli military channels during and around the attack, remained among the most heavily protected secrets in the entire affair. The NSA had conducted its own internal review of the Liberty incident and had reached conclusions that were never shared with the Naval Corps or with the public. When some of these materials were finally partially declassified decades later, they became ammunition for researchers and survivors arguing the official account was false. But by then, most of the key decision makers were dead. Memories had faded, and the political will to revisit the matter was small. After the gag order was eventually lifted, informally, over time, as the political pressure to maintain them became harder to enforce, survivors began to speak out. They formed the USS Liberty Veterans Association and dedicated themselves to achieving three things: a full independent congressional investigation of the attack and the cover-up, formal accountability, and recognition for the men who had died and been wounded, the kind of public, honored recognition that the political suppression had denied them. They were met repeatedly and constantly with institutional failure. Congressional officers that received their letters referred them to committees. The committees referred them to the Navy. The Navy referred them to the court. The court findings pointed back to a record that was largely classified. It was a circle designed to go nowhere. The survivors testified before various bodies over the years. They wrote letters to presidents, they briefed journalists, and they connected with researchers. And they were, for most of their active years, largely ignored by the mainstream press and by the political establishment. But we must zoom out to see the bigger picture. Servicemen go into harm's way on the understanding if they are attacked, their government will demand accountability. If they die, their government will tell the truth about how and why they died. If they are wrong, their government will seek justice on their behalf. Every single one of those obligations was violated in the Liberty case. The men were sent into a dangerous position without adequate protection. When they were attacked, rescue was withheld. When they survived, they were silenced. When they died, their families were denied the truth. When they fought for justice, the government they had served turned against them. The Naval Court was not just a flawed investigation, it was a betrayal. Used not to find the truth, but to manufacture a political acceptable substitute for it, and to bury the real record deep enough that the men who knew the truth would be dead before anyone could act on it. But some of you might be asking, why would Israel attack its own ally in this way? Well, to answer this question, we need to look at the Six-Day War. By June 8, 1967, Israeli forces had essentially destroyed the Egyptian army in the Sinai. What was happening on the ground in those final hours of the Sinai campaign, particularly around El Arish, was deeply sensitive. Israeli forces had executed Egyptian prisoners of war during this period. The numbers involved in this alleged execution was significant. Estimated ranged into the hundreds. These were not minor battlefield incidents. If true, they contested serious war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. The USS Liberty, sitting approximately 13 miles off the Sinai coast with the most sophisticated signals intelligence equipment in the Navy, was in a position to intercept communications related to those operations. Israeli military units in the field communicate, orders are given, reports are made. A ship capable of capturing all of their electronic traffic in real time represented an extraordinary intelligence risk to any operation that could not bear outside scrutiny. One powerful motive for silencing the Liberty was to prevent the NSA from collecting evidence of war crimes being committed by Israeli forces in the Sinai. If the Liberty's intercepts captured orders to execute prisoners, or after action reports confirming it, that intelligence would have been gone directly to Washington. It would have created a difficult diplomatic and political situation, destroying the Liberty intelligence gathering capability, and ideally the ship itself, so that whatever had been collected went to the bottom of the Mediterranean, would have eliminated all that risk. The second part to this motive is what Israel was planning to do next. By June 8th, Egypt was effectively defeated. Israeli military attention was turning towards Syria and the Golan Heights. There was a significant political dimension to this. The United States had not authorized Israel to attack Syria. The Johnson administration was deeply nervous about Israeli action on the Syrian front because of the risk of drawing the Soviet Union into the conflict. If the Soviets intervened, a regional war could become something far more dangerous. Israel may have been concerned that the Liberty was collecting signals intelligence that would give Washington advance warning and real-time intelligence about Israeli intentions regarding Syria, intelligence that could be used to pressure Israel to halt its operation before the Golan Heights was taken. A fully operational Liberty would have given the Johnson administration the ability to monitor and potentially intervene in Israeli military planning. Silencing the Liberty would have given Israel freedom of action on the Syrian front, without American intelligence oversight. Another theory on motive came from Israeli intentions to sink the ship. The theory holds that Israel's intention was not merely to damage or silence the Liberty, but to sink her completely. If the plan had succeeded, the blame was to attribute the sinking to Egypt. In 1967, the Johnson administration and significant portions of the public were broadly sympathetic to Israel, but not necessarily committed to direct involvement in the conflict. A dramatic incident such as the sinking of an American naval vessel attributed to Egyptian forces. This could have brought the U.S. directly into the war on Israel's side. It would have been in effect a false flag operation, an attack designed to look like the work of an enemy in order to trigger an American response against that enemy. The reason I bring this up is because the attack was sustained and comprehensive enough that sinking the Liberty was a plausible intended outcome. The combination of airstrikes, napalm, and 5 torpedoes was more than sufficient firepower to send the ship to the bottom. The fact that the Liberty survived was due to extraordinary damage control work by her crew, not to any restraint on the part of the attacker. The destruction of life rafts is most logically explained if the intention was to leave no survivors who could identify the attackers. Survivors would have immediately identified Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats. A ship sunk with all its crew members would have left no witnesses to contradict whatever narrative the attackers chose to present. The timing was also perfect, in the middle of a war with Egypt, with Egyptian forces in the area that would have made Egypt the natural suspect had the Liberty gone down. What disrupted this plan, if it existed, was the extraordinary resilience of the Liberty herself and her crew. She did not sink, enough men survived, a distress call got out, and once those facts were established, the false flag option collapsed, because there were living witnesses who knew exactly what had happened. But more interesting was Israel's response after the attack. Within hours of the attack ending, the Israeli government contacted the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv and expressed a carefully worded expression of regret. This was not a full apology in any legal or diplomatic sense. The language used was deliberately chosen to convey sympathy for American casualties while avoiding any admission of wrongdoing, criminal liability, or intentional conduct. Israel was reaching out to shape the diplomatic situation almost before the Liberty's dead had been counted. The framing was established within hours and never fundamentally deviated from any official Israeli communication. This rapid establishment of a narrative was not the behavior of a military establishment genuinely shocked and confused by what had happened. It was the behavior of a government that had prepared explanation ready to deploy. As documented earlier, Israeli torpedo boats approached the Liberty after the attack and offered assistance. By offering assistance, Israel was simultaneously projecting an image of concern and good faith, while also potentially seeking to get Israeli personnel aboard the American vessel, where they might have been able to assess what intelligence the Liberty had collected and what evidence of the attack remained. Whether this was the intent behind the offer cannot be proven, but it is a detail worth considering given everything else that is documented about Israel's behavior that day. Israel's formal position, articulated in the days following the attack and maintained ever since, was that Israeli forces had mistaken the U.S. Liberty for the Egyptian vessel, El Qusayr. But the El Qusayr was not even in the area on June 8th. She was in a completely different location. The ship that Israel claimed to have mistaken the Liberty for was not present in the waters where the attack occurred. A central pillar of Israel's mistaken identity argument was the assertion that the Liberty was not flying an American flag at the time of the attack, or that weather conditions made the flag impossible to see clearly. But the physical evidence says otherwise. The Liberty was flying her standard American ensign throughout the morning. When that flag was shot down during the attack, crew members immediately ran up a larger flag, a ceremonial flag significantly larger than the standard one, approximately 5 feet by 8 feet. The flag was recovered after the attack as evidence. Weather conditions on that day were clear and calm. Visibility was excellent. There was a sufficient breeze to keep a flag extended and readable. Multiple crew members testified to the flag's presence and visibility. Israel also argued at various points that the Liberty was traveling at a speed inconsistent with American vessels in the area, that she appeared to be moving at a higher speed, suggesting an Egyptian military vessel rather than a slow-moving American ship. The Liberty was barely making way, moving at approximately 5 knots. This is consistent with an intelligence-gathering vessel operating slowly to maximize collection effectiveness. 5 knots is not the speed of a military vessel engaged in aggressive action. This idea was proven wrong. The Israeli investigation was not independent. It was conducted internally by the IDF, the same institution whose forces had carried out the attack. There was no external oversight, no international component, and no American participation. The investigation's finding predictably supported the official position. It concluded that the attack had been the result of a genuine misidentification, a tragic error made under the fog of war by forces acting in good faith. It found no criminal wrongdoing on the part of any Israeli military personnel involved in the attack. No pilot was disciplined, no naval officer was court-martialed, no commander faced any professional consequence whatsoever. Israel eventually paid compensation to the family of the 34 men killed in the attack. The payments were explicitly framed by Israel as ex gratia payments, a legal term meaning voluntary payments made out of goodwill or moral obligation, specifically not constituting an admission of legal liability or wrongdoing. This ex gratia framing was crucial and deliberate. By accepting payments structured this way, and not by formally contesting that framing, the United States government effectively helped Israel establish a diplomatic, a legal record in which the compensation payments could never be cited as evidence of Israeli acknowledgement of fault. It was money designed to close a wound, while simultaneously ensuring that the closing of that wound created no legal or historical precedent of accountability. From 1967, the official Israeli government position remained exactly what it had been established as within hours of the attack. This was a tragic case of mistaken identity. Israel deeply regrets the loss of American lives, and the matter was properly investigated and resolved through compensation. No Israeli prime minister ever deviated from this position in any official capacity. No Israeli defense minister acknowledged anything beyond the official line. The institution position was maintained with consistency across multiple governments and multiple decades. But this wasn't enough. In order to get another narrative out there, a book was written called The Liberty Incident by J. Crystal, a U.S. federal judge and Navy Reserve officer, which argued for the mistaken identity position. Crystal was given extraordinary access to Israeli military archives and officials, access that no other researcher had received and that was clearly not extended to researchers taking a more critical view of the official narrative. The Crystal book was effectively Israel's official rebuttal dressed up as an independent scholarship. It was presented as an objective historical investigation, while being produced with the full cooperation and support of the Israeli military establishment. Crystal was given access to Israeli military records and personnel. No survivor of the Liberty attack was given comprehensible access to Israeli archives. No independent historian, critical of the mistaken identity conclusion, was offered interviews with Israeli pilots. The Israeli military establishment opened its doors to exactly one researcher, the one who concluded, before his research was complete, that Israel's explanation was correct. When one party controls which researchers get access to its records, and grants that access exclusively to researchers predisposed towards that party, the resulting work cannot credibly claim the status of independent scholarship. Crystal acknowledges that Israeli aircraft flew over the Liberty during the morning, but argues that these overflights were inconclusive, that the pilots did not or could not make a definitive identification of the vessel as American. But crew members aboard the Liberty could clearly see the Israeli markings on the aircraft and could distinguish the faces of people inside of it. If the Liberty's crew could see the Israeli aircraft clearly enough to identify it, then the Israeli aircraft crew could see the Liberty clearly enough to identify her. Plus, these were not primitive machines with limited observation equipment. They carried cameras and observation systems specifically designed for ship identification. The argument that trained military reconnaissance crews, making multiple dedicated observations passes over a single vessel on a clear day with excellent visibility, could not make a positive identification is simply not credible. Israeli military logs confirmed that the Liberty was specifically logged and discussed within the Israeli military command structure during the morning, which means the ship was not a vague, unidentified target, but a specific vessel that had been noted and tracked. Crystal's argument requires accepting that a vessel specifically logged in Israeli military records was somehow not identified. Another argument that Crystal makes is that the Liberty and El Qusair were similar under the fog of battle, but this doesn't work because their profiles were entirely different. The Liberty had an antenna. electronic arrays, and intelligence-gathering superstructure that made her unmistakable from a Egyptian military or cargo vessel. The LQ-SEER was a simple single-stack cargo transport with none of these features. Looking at the Liberty, anyone would not see a ship similar with LQ-SEER. Another piece of evidence was Liberty's hull number, GTR number 5, which was painted in large characters on her bow, clearly visible from the air. No Egyptian vessel bore these markings. The visual evidence alone makes the LQ-SEER comparison fail. But the purpose of the book was to push a certain narrative that Israel wanted people to believe. Even the book doesn't answer the questions that many people have asked about the official mistaken identity narrative, like the ones mentioned previously in the video. And if the author of this book, whom was given extra information that no other researcher was given, cannot give us a realistic answer, then we must come to our own conclusions. Let me know what you think about this attack in the comments below. Do you believe the official story of mistaken identity? Or was there something more sinister at play? Are the other theories given believable? This is up to you, the viewer, to decide. If you enjoy this type of content, subscribe for future videos.